Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Passing into the Future, the official PASS podcast that connects students to resources and advice on school, the workforce, and life. We're your co-hosts, Io.
I'm Nyla.
So this season 2, we're going to focus on research. So 80% of past members that took our member survey said that they did intend to go to graduate school, and almost 50% of people said that they weren't in a research lab, but they were interested in joining one. So we wanted to do a season dedicated to getting you guys the information and resources to develop your research skills. Today, we're here with Dr. Maureen Kenny. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm excited to be here. I'm Dr. Kenny. I'm an associate chair in the Department of Psychology, and I also have a research lab. My training is as a clinical psychologist, so I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Florida. I've been teaching at FIU for quite a while. I don't want to date myself, but I teach primarily in the Applied Social and Cultural Psychology program, which is a doctoral program, and then also in the professional counseling program, which is a master's program that prepares individuals to be licensed mental health counselors.
Perfect. And Dr. Kenny, we saw that you were the PI for the Mass Lab, which we saw specializes in child abuse prevention, the mandatory reporting, and then the Latinx and child sexual abuse, as well as commercial exploitation. So we were kind of just wondering, how did your interest in this area develop? We saw that your PhD thesis was also on child physical and sexual abuse, and we were just sort of interested, how did you first develop an interest in that field?
Sure. So when I began my doctoral program in clinical psychology, I sought out a mentor by looking at the different kinds of research that people were doing, right? And the mentor that I was sort of drawn to was doing work in child abuse. And we had a clinic where we saw child victims of sexual abuse. And so I did both clinical work there, treating some of the children, but then also supervised some of the research that we were doing there. In clinical programs, it's not uncommon for the clinics that are providing treatment to also be collecting data on that treatment, and providing an evidence base for the treatment. So that's really how I got started in it. It was being sort of attracted to that mentor and the kind of work she was doing, and then being exposed to it in the both in the lab and in the clinic.
Perfect, nice. And we would sort of love to like rewind the tape a bit, right? So we would love for you to give us a brief rundown of what the process was like to get from where you are today. For example, how was your journey of navigating life from your undergrad to your PhD?
Yeah, so that was an interesting journey that takes me back. I'm a first generation student, so I didn't have any parents or family members to advise me on college or graduate school. So I guess fortunately I was pretty smart. Hopefully I still am. And I got, I applied to colleges. I went to Rutgers University in New Jersey. That's where I was living at the time. So that was much like FIU, like a large state university. It was affordable for my family. And I majored in psychology. I had taken a class in psychology as an undergraduate. I'm sorry, in high school, we had like a split class in like sociology and psychology. And as soon as I was exposed to that material in high school, I was like, wow, this is really interesting to me. I was very curious about sort of how the mind worked and what caused different behaviors. So I declared myself a psychology major when I went to college, and stayed that way. I know a lot of people take different journeys and maybe begin with one major and change, but for me, I started as a psychology major and finished. During my undergraduate degree, I worked in a lab, which is part of what I know you're interested in. We had the ability to work in labs for credit, much like you can at FIU. So I looked at some opportunities. I actually contacted a professor and I was interested in some eating disorders research that he was doing. Contacted him or his research assistants, and they weren't taking undergrads in that lab based on the nature of the work. Later, I came to understand that more as a doctoral student, right? That the people that were working with the individuals with eating disorders were highly trained, advanced level graduate students, and there really wasn't a lot for undergrads to do. The nature of that disorder too requires, specialized training. So he said, I have an alcohol behavior research lab. We have openings in that. And I said, okay, I'll give that a try. Sounded interesting. And that's how I sort of, kind of stumbled into that experience.
Perfect. And then for graduate school, how was the process of looking at different mentoring professors, and how did you end up finding one that was aligned with your personal values and your interests? Like, how was it a difficult process? Did you have to apply to a lot of labs?
Yeah, well, you have to apply to a lot of graduate schools, actually, so we
Yeah.
can start there. As I said, as an undergrad, I really didn't, nobody in my family had gone to college. I wasn't even aware that I was going to have to go to graduate school after college. So I was talking to some of the doctoral students that worked in the alcohol behavior research lab. And we would have a lot of downtime, between running subjects. And they started to talk to me about being doctoral students and what they were doing and the process of applying to graduate school. And at the time, one of them was actually writing a book for the American Psychological Association entitled Applying to Graduate School.
Mhm.
So it was a great, it was a great resource. And sort of started talking to them, talked to other students, talked to some students that were like a year ahead of me that were applying. And that's when I started the application process.
Mhm.
I also at the same time went to a graduate student affair, at Rutgers, which like we're having today actually at FIU, and started to talk to different schools, and they sort of outlined for me like, oh, well, this is what you'll need to do. You'll need to get some sort of a graduate degree, either a master's or a doctoral degree. So that was kind of a rude awakening for me. I wasn't really prepared, but I really didn't know anything. And I can say that the advising that I got as an undergraduate at a large public university was not very good. There weren't advisors like we have these days to guide students. So I was just stumbling along, opening the catalog, checking off the boxes I needed, and ensuring that I, took all my classes. So then I started the journey to graduate school, and at the time, the American Psychological Association had a big book on applying to graduate school, where it listed all the different doctoral programs in psychology by state, and it told you a little bit about each program and the tracks that they had, whether it was clinical or social or developmental, and then how many applications they got, and information like that. I'm going back because I was applying to school at a time when we didn't have the internet or smartphones where
Right.
you could look that stuff up in 2 minutes. But that book became, my Bible. I was, flagging the pages and highlighting stuff and really kind of studying that and thinking about, where I wanted to go. And then, creating a resume and starting the process of applying to graduate schools. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love to hear that whole journey because I resonate with that a lot. As someone who, like, my parents didn't even finish high school, you kind of were in the process by yourself, and you have to kind of rely on yourself and do your own research, and it's really hard. I think that's a part of the reason why me and EO started this podcast, because we were kind of at a loss for information.
Yeah.
We had no idea what it took to apply to grad school, so we started to talk to professors, and they were saying that you need research, like at least 2 years of research, you need a good CV, and it's things like that where even if you do your own research, if you don't have a good mentor, it's kind of hard to know exactly what it takes to get into the specific programs. I think one of the past interviews that we had, how many schools did they say to apply to?
I think it was like a minimum of like 6, like
Mhm.
even
I was
9.
gonna say 7 or 8, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought like with 3 schools, like you're good, you know? And so it's
Yeah.
small things like that where it can really affect you and push you back a whole cycle just because you didn't know like you had to apply to at least
Yeah.
7 schools, you know?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
to even consider like the cost of that, right? Applying to some schools is like up to $100 depending on the school. It might range from like 30 to 100. And to also factor in the cost of the GRE, how long
Correct.
scores last, what schools take the GRE. I think
Mhm.
that was a lot of the information we just found out.
Right.
But I did want to
Mhm.
kind of go back to your story being first generation and ask you, what do you think are the major things for other first generation students, right, who don't have access to this same kind of the same kind of mentorship from parents? Like, what do you think are the main challenges they might face and the main tips you have for them going into applying for graduate school?
Yeah, well, I think, we're fortunate at FIU to have a first generation initiative, right? And, there are resources available and advisors to help first generation students at FIU, which is something that when I went to school, we didn't even talk about. I didn't know I was first generation, I just knew that I was going to college. But like many FIU students, my parents were immigrants. They hadn't reached advanced studies. They had left their country for better choices for their family. So I will say one thing that is to believe in yourself that you can do it. I don't think there was ever a time that I doubted that I could do it. I just didn't know what I had to do. So I think that's one thing that we try to stress too when we work with the first generation students is, just because nobody else has forged this path in your family doesn't mean that you can't. So to believe in yourself and take advantage of the things that are out there. As you mentioned, that the cost can be, prohibitive, right? One of the things that we do at FIU is we provide not tuition, application waivers, excuse me, for when students are applying. So if they reach out to us and say, I'd like to apply, but that fee is, one of many, we have the ability to provide some of those waivers. So don't be afraid to ask.
Mhm.
And I sort of wish that I had asked more questions early on. But it's hard to know what to ask if you don't know what to ask.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's sort of a double-edged, like I didn't know that I should be asking because I didn't. And there's also sometimes a lot of trepidation when you're first gen, right? And you're feeling embarrassed or, everybody else seems to speak this language or know what's happening and you don't. And that can be hard to kind of, take initiative and sort of break through that. So hopefully that answers your question. But I think believing in yourself and not being afraid to ask, is there a waiver? Is there any funding for that? But we have students ask that of us all the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's honestly great advice, right?
Mhm.
Not being afraid to ask, I think, is one of the things that even I suffer from as a student. And like hearing professors say that really shows that like things are a little bit more flexible. The kind of time old adage, ask and you shall receive is a lot more powerful than I think we are taught to think about things. Like I feel like often a lot of students, and me included, we think, okay, these are the rules and we have to follow to the T, and we forget we're dealing with people who have systems that are created also to help us. And because we don't know they exist, we don't even know to ask for them.
Right. And when we're talking about psychology, hopefully you're dealing with people that have also had some training in human behavior and empathy and understanding
Right.
and
Right.
flexibility. So, that you hope that those those characteristics are evident. But to continue on the journey, I applied to graduate school. I did, as you said, I took the GRE. I think I took a subject area in psychology as well. We also had to take at that time a couple other crazy little tests like the Miller's analogy test and
Okay.
all sorts of these like very esoteric tests, which I think thankfully they don't use anymore. And then I started, I think the advice for applying to graduate school is to really look at the programs that you're applying to and say to yourself, Can I live there for 5 years? You know, is that a
Yeah.
place that I want to be for 5 years?
Mhm.
Is that somewhere I'm going to feel comfortable? Am I going to, it sounds silly, but like the climate, like the people, the culture of the area, the politics of the state, these are all things to think about, because when you're embarking on a doctoral degree, it's a while, you're going to
Yeah.
be there for a while. So, and you want to be happy, So, and then looking at, the best way to choose a program is really looking at the schools that have programs you want, and then the faculty that are doing the kind of work you want to do, because when you enter any program, and I'll speak from a clinical lens, but when you enter any doctoral program, you're often applying to work with a particular mentor, and that's something too that I didn't really understand, but you're sort of picking someone out and saying, hey, I like the kind of work you do. This is what I want to do. From the other side of things, as a faculty member, when we get applications, we're looking for students that want to work with us too, right? If I'm doing primarily abuse and maltreatment and violence work, if you're not interested in that, we may not have a good fit, right? It's and I may not be able to help you meet your career goals, right? So it's a little bit of a balancing act between wanting to find a mentor who's sort of doing the work that you want to do, but we're not looking, I'm not looking to produce a mini me,
Yeah.
I don't want somebody who's just gonna, replicate, but I do want to be able to use the knowledge and skills I have to best help a student. And so if they're sort of working in the arena that I work in, I can do that the best,
Mhm. And on that similar vein, since you are a mentoring professor, right, and you have to look through a lot of like people that apply to your lab, how much would you say an applicant's personality or general attitude affects their chances of getting into your lab? If everyone has sort of the same like statistics and
Yes.
scores, what for you helps discern, the type of student that you would want to work with or accept into your program?
Okay. So two different questions. One is somebody that I would accept into my lab as an undergrad, right?
Yes.
Shall we
Well,
start with that?
I sort of meant that on both levels.
And then graduate school.
And then
Yeah.
graduate
Yeah,
school.
yeah.
A
Yeah.
So let
research
me,
assistant and
Yeah.
then a
right, I
PhD
understand.
student.
Yeah. So on the undergraduate level, anytime we put out a call for research assistants, we get a lot, some of the work we do in abuse and the work I do in human trafficking is of interest to students. They're sort of, sexy topics, for lack of a better word. It's not, no offense to my cogneuro colleagues, but we're sort of doing work that's kind of attractive to people. They've read
Mhm.
about it in the news or media accounts or films. So the first thing we look for is the stage of growth that the student's at. I really don't want to take somebody who's in their final semester at FIU, because it takes us a while to train students. And so by the time we train you, you're leaving, right? So
Yeah.
we're sort of ideally looking for somebody who's, going into their junior year and would be able to commit at least for their junior year, and hopefully their junior and senior year, and then move into a senior level in the lab. So that's the first thing. The other thing about applying sort of late is, if you're applying as your second semester senior year, I'm also thinking, how serious are you about this, right? Because you really haven't done your homework to know that you should have been involved in a lab, much earlier, right? So that's one thing we look for. To your point, yes, a lot of people have the same sort of resume, right? They've got a great GPA, they're majoring in psychology, so we sometimes look for skills that they might have that would be a little out of the box. Like maybe you worked in customer service, maybe you worked in retail, I like students that have worked in retail, because I know they've dealt with a lot of, difficult,
Personalities.
right, personalities, and it's multitasking at times, right? You're ringing somebody up, you're doing something on the floor, so not that there's a job that's a preference, but you don't be afraid to include those things on your resume, because we look at those as translatable skills, So you handled the front desk at a medical office, great, same thing. You handled a lot of calls. You had to be organized. You kept files. You had a system, So, we just look for skills that we think a student might have. And then I guess the biggest thing is that they have an interest in the kind of work we're doing, that there's something about the work we're doing that sort of sparked their interest, whether they have a personal connection to it or have just, were exposed to it in class and thought, oh, wow, this is, I want to learn more about this, or, we want you to sort of have a passion for the work you do, right? Not that, it's got to be what you want to do forever, but that you have an interest in it,
Yeah.
because as you work in the lab, we'll be generating ideas and spitballing new studies. And so if you're, invested in that, you're more likely to provide some of that, hey, what about this, Dr. Kenny? Or, maybe we should try that. So yeah, those are, it's great if people already have some research experience. Obviously, if they've already worked in a lab, some of the other things are like, have they done their city training, so that they can work with you, and you're familiar with that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right.
Just
So
for our viewers though, just to
Okay,
explain
sure.
it to them. So this, did you want to go ahead?
No.
Okay, so the city training, there are different types, but it's basically I think the one you're talking about is the social and behavioral research one, right?
Correct. Yeah.
That kind of speaks of HIPAA rules and how to basically be competent in doing research that relates to people. I think there's actually a specific one. It's called HIPS. I don't remember what it
Yeah,
stands for, but
yeah.
it does focus on HIPAA as well. So they overlap to some degree. But if you're working in a lab dealing with victims of abuse, you do need to have a level of competency in how to speak to someone who is,
Right.
has done that.
And then depending on the different labs, I know that there's different requirements. Like I worked in the school ready lab, and then since it works with people, they have a humans research course. So
Yes.
depending on the lab, they'll let you know what type of courses to take.
I think that's the social behavioral.
No, there's
it's
like a lot.
completely different one?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Well, there's
Read the whole website.
there's social behavioral, and then there's animal research. So those are really the two big ones,
Mhm.
whether you're working with, quote, human subjects, people, or animals. Those are the two main institutional review boards. I was an IRB member at FIU for 8 years. So,
Wow.
and then within that, right, there's certain trainings are all online for your listenership. All the trainings are online. They can be completed. It's free. It's but it basically teaches you about ethical behavior in a lab. So if somebody already has that, that's great, right? That shows us that they already completed the online training, that they've taken that initiative, and sometimes it can take a while to complete that. So that means good, they're up and running.
Mhm.
If they've already taken some research methods classes and they're familiar with SPSS or R, some sort of software, that's like a bonus. That's that's like a holiday come early for us, but if not, we can teach them those kinds of things. So.
Perfect. And so then I would also like to extend that question for the graduate level, right? Since there's a lot of different things to look at, different experiences, different GRE scores. What helps you set an applicant apart at the graduate level?
Right. So currently we don't require GRE scores
Okay.
in our program, so that there's been a sort of national movement away from standardized testing for a number of reasons, mostly related to people's access to resources, the difference in test taking and so forth. So we don't currently look at those, but absolutely at the doctoral level, we're looking for people that have worked in labs, that have had some research experience for a couple of reasons. The first one is you're going to be doing a lot of research. So if you haven't done any, you're sort of entering a program where that's what you're going to do. So how do you know you're going to like it, right? If you haven't done it. So that's the biggest one. And so then we're hoping if people have had research experience, they're applying to a doctoral program, they know what they're getting into, right? And then the second is that you'll have that skill set, right? You're already, you've already got some basic foundational skills of how to do a literature review, again, use some software, use some statistical software, you have an understanding of, ethical and professional behavior in a lab. You work well with others, you know, you don't run with scissors, I don't know. So those are some of the things, you know, that it's really critical that students get involved in those kinds of experiences as an undergrad before applying to graduate school. And some students who don't, you know, will take a gap year and do that kind of work. And, you know, that's another way to do it. In addition to applying to labs as an undergraduate, you know, there's a bunch of other experiences you can apply to. You know, NSF has these research extensive undergraduate experiences that are available in the summer for students to apply to. And they're geared towards students that have very little lab experience, students from minoritized populations that haven't had access to, you know, mentoring. So those are available, and those are typically paid positions. They're highly competitive, but it's another way to, you know, spend your summer getting, you know, fully immersed in a lab.
Yeah. And we did also want to kind of find out, this is going maybe a little bit behind the scenes. How long have you been a mentoring professor?
Well, I think that I've been a mentoring professor in some capacity since I began as an academic. I mean, whether you're mentoring students in a lab or mentoring them through their doctoral dissertation process. When I was teaching primarily in a counseling program, I was mentoring students who were becoming licensed professionals, you know. So I think mentorship is a very basic part of what we do as academics, you know, depending on the kind of program you're in. But in most psychology related programs, you know, you're serving as a mentor to students.
Yeah, of course. That's definitely understandable, you know, just like how you were kind of saying earlier, you reached out to different professors and us graduate students to find out what you needed to do to basically end up in their shoes. You know, of course, your students would want to do the same. And could you tell us a little bit more about the process of kind of creating a lab? Like, how does one go about, you know, setting up a research lab?
Yeah, so, you know, there's multiple ways to go about it, but, you know, the first thing people usually do is sort of or maybe this isn't in any particular order, but, you know, create a name for your lab, right? You know, something that's sort of going to kind of identify, you know, your space and the kind of work you're doing. And so, you know, we used an acronym of MAST. Some people will just have something more, you know, the sleep research lab or the, you know, what, you know, something like that. Or some people name the lab with their name, you know, so it'd be like the Kenny lab or something like that. So you're looking for a way to let people know that there's a community that exists, you know, that there's this lab space. Most people secure funding, right, in the form of grants from federal or other organizations to sort of fund their lab. And by fund their lab, I mean provide funding for students that would work in the lab as doctoral students and provide funding for the faculty member to take time away from their other duties to be able to spend time doing the research and working in the lab. From there, you know, you probably establish a lab based on the kinds of projects that you have going on. Again, the funded projects that you have, and then advertising for, you know, undergraduate and graduate students to work in the lab. I think a website is pretty, you know, pretty commonplace for people so that it's a, you know, with people searching for information online now, that's a great way for someone to look at a lab, read about what they do. You know, we usually try to post pictures of if they want, you know, the graduates or undergraduate students that are working in the lab. So people can kind of get a sense of what's happening and who's working there and see if they feel like they would belong there.
Okay. Yeah, I think websites, especially in 2024, very easy, you know, for people to kind of go through, see the FAQs, see the research, and kind of help gauge their interest.
Right. A lot of people have Instagram accounts also for their labs. You know, that's a great way to spread the information about, you know, the papers that you're publishing, the research that you're doing, you know, any way that you're engaged. So, you know, what we're finding at the university is, you know, a print brochure isn't going to be what attracts a student to, you know, a lab. It's going to be, you know, hitting, you know, finding some activity on, social media that highlights what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, no, social media is definitely a great place to really get students. Because even like me, I follow a lot of the FIU different pages to keep up. Like I check that more than I even check my email sometimes.
That's
Um,
great. It's good to know that they're working.
Oh yeah, definitely. Um, and so we did want to kind of go back a little bit to discussing undergrad students who are interested in becoming research assistants. I know, you did talk a little bit about some preferred qualifications, right, that would help them really shine through. I did want to ask though about the interview, right? Because it's one thing to get through that application, you can kind of do that in your own time. Um, but once you get to the interview, that is often, the make or break moment for some people. So I guess, what are you looking for in an interview with someone who's interested in being a research assistant at your lab?
Right. It's probably a question that is answered differently by every researcher.
Yeah.
So for me, personally, I'm a bit of an extrovert, so I probably prefer extroverted people, because I want to feel like I'm connecting with them and I'm getting a little feedback. I'm getting some, facial and other cues as to how, we're getting along. Um, so for me, I want somebody during that interview who's, shows a little animation, right? Shows a
Mhm.
little, like I didn't just wake them up out of a slumber, and also knows about the lab, right?
Yeah.
So, is asking some questions based on having read about the lab and comes to the interview prepared. Maybe that's the
Mhm.
best way to say it, right? So, maybe look at a little bit of the research that was recently published by that professor of that lab so you can get a sense of the work that they do and, ask a question about that or have an inquiry about that. That shows me that you've done a little bit of homework, you've spent
Mhm.
some time, researching what we do and that you're interested in it. Maybe you can, if you've interviewed, are there things that you've sort of wondered about during an interview or?
What are some, I guess, insightful questions that would kind of impress you from an applicant? What is like something you think would be a great question for them to ask?
Right. I think it would be good to ask, like, what specifically are going to be my roles and duties,
Mm.
so that we can be upfront about what they're going to do. Again, there's usually a bit of a hierarchy in a lab, right? You're not going to come in day one and be, yeah, you're starting out doing certain level tasks and then you move up.
Yeah.
And many undergrads move up to sort of like managing your lab or managing a project, but that's not going to be day one. So I think it's a good idea to ask, like, what are the tasks in your lab? And that will vary, right? Again, if you're working in animal research, maybe you're weighing the animals, maybe you're calibrating the scales, maybe if you're working in, human subjects, maybe you're, preparing the qualtrics of the surveys that the person's going to be answering, or you're making the flyers that, recruit people. Um, that actually leads me to like a certain amount of creativity and like tech
Mhm.
savvy from the undergrads is something I look for because, that's not as much in my wheelhouse as it is in the younger generation. So when a student comes in and says like, oh yeah, I made flyers all the time, or I was in charge of this for, a club or a group, it's like, oh great, you've got some graphic design background or some sort of creative or artistic background. Believe it or not, that can be really helpful, in a psychology lab. So things like that would be good. But I think to be clear about what it is you're going to do, so there's no misunderstanding about the role that the student will take in the lab. The other thing for the interview is to be prepared and set aside the time. So I've sometimes, perhaps had a Zoom interview with a student and they're at work, and they're like, hold on a second. And it's like, okay, you definitely want to schedule your interview during a time that you can be not distracted. And I understand that people live in places where they, maybe don't have privacy and they've got to, use earphones or whatever, that's fine. But to not be, hold on, let me take care of this customer,
Yeah.
that's not the best way to set up, your interview. And then have forwarded a copy of your resume again before the
Mhm.
interview Believe it or not, as faculty, we get a lot of emails a day. So, you know, maybe right before the interview, wanted to give you another copy of my resume so you have it handy. You know, that for someone like me, that'd be great. It's like, I don't have to go sifting for that. Here it is, you know. And then sending a thank you note, you know, a thank you email. Hey, it was a great interview. Really looking forward to that. Expressing your availability during the interview, right? So, you know, to be honest about that, you know, I have class Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but Tuesdays and Thursdays I'm completely open, or, you know, and some labs will require very much in-person work, and a lot of the work can be done remotely. So I think that's important to kind of find out, because that can give you a different sense too of your connectability with the others, right? Like, is there a physical space we work in? Is a lot of the work done off campus, right? Some research is not done on FIU at all. You know, you've got to travel to a site. I think you said you did the school readiness or the
Yes,
leading.
yeah.
Those are done at schools, right?
Yes, yeah. We had to go to, I think it was Liberty City, and we would do interviews on the children there.
Right, right. So, you know, knowing what is required of you means you had to have reliable transportation to get there. You had to, you know, so those kinds of things I think are, you know, come prepared. We as faculty are interviewing you, but you're also interviewing us to make sure it's a good fit for you for the lab, you know? So I have students that don't have transportation, wouldn't be able to get to schools. So, you know, they've got to do work on campus, right? You know, or remote work.
I know you said earlier, you know, every time you open up that application, you do get a lot of interest. How competitive would you say your lab is?
It's pretty competitive because we get a lot of interest and we don't take a lot of students. So that might be the best way to put it. There are labs that need a lot more manpower, and so maybe they wouldn't be as competitive, you know. Not to say that they're not as selective, but they need a lot of people, you know.
Yeah.
We don't need a lot of people. So the people that we choose, we've really kind of you know, interviewed and made sure that they're going to be a good fit for us.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so, you know, we typically have students who work directly with me, and then students who work with each of the doctoral students too. So the doctoral students that work under me also then have undergrad students that work under them. So, depending on how many projects we have going on, how much help we need, that's sort of how we decide whether we're, you know, recruiting more students, right?
That definitely makes sense. It's also going to depend, of course, on like the workload that's necessitated at that moment, not just in general, you know, the general amount of people that's needed. I think those are all my questions. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I kind of would like to know a little bit more about your mass lab, specifically what you specialize, if you can explain for the viewers, like the different projects that you have, and then the scopes that they cover.
Right. So my lab deals with, you know, abuse, violence, maltreatment, you know, all the really dark sides of, you know, human behavior. But just to step back with that, when I was in training and working with victims of sexual abuse, you know, I also got interested in mandatory reporting, because a lot of the victims that we treated at the clinic had been abused for years and nobody had reported it. And it's like, wow, you know, the doctor knew about this, the teacher, you know. And so that sort of got me very interested in like, what's going on that people aren't reporting this. So also a part of my lab, which you had said before, is, you know, educating people about child abuse reporting, about their responsibility as mandated reporters. We've done some work analyzing laws in different countries and in different states to see crossover or overlap. One study that we just finished in conjunction with a legal psychology faculty member was taking a look at all the 50 United States and their laws regarding parental substance abuse as a form of child abuse. So in addition to things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, states have begun to recognize that parents who use substances in a manner that causes impairment for them in their ability to care for their child, or causes direct harm to the child, right? Like, I've left out my cocaine or my crack and my kid gets into it, or,
Yeah.
leaving around liquor. All of those are, reportable forms of maltreatment. So that's kind of an example of a study we did recently. Because that was largely for lack of a better word, a web-based, we reviewed LexisNexis, we reviewed laws, we went, that kind of thing. That didn't require like physical labor in a sense, it was mental labor on the computer and checking and double checking and triple checking things and having people check each other's work. So that's something that we've done. We also do a lot of evaluation of prevention programs, so child sexual abuse prevention programs that are offered in the schools. Determining their effectiveness, determining how many children may come forward or disclose abuse based on that. I have a student right now, an undergrad student actually, who's a McNair scholar. She's working on, or just finished her data collection on students, college students' perceptions of different types of parenting practices and whether people consider them abusive based on their cultural background, right? So our lab is sort of interested in the intersection between, parenting and culture, right? And we know that different cultures have different child rearing practices, right? Some cultures, you keep the baby really close, you carry them around with you. Other cultures, you put them in a room, by themselves, and you fervorize them and let them cry themselves to sleep. So, based on that, we have an interest in sort of like, how does some of this behavior differ based on people's cultural background and, immigration status? And then, what's the range of behavior? What's the range of sort of, potentially abusive behavior and people's thoughts about it? So that's another thing that we're doing. We also similarly just finished collecting data on sibling practices in homes, which also can relate to sexual abuse. Like, again, homes differ in the amount of nudity, perhaps, co-sleeping, showering together, and sibling sexual abuse is on the rise. We know that there's a lot of, intrafamilial sexual abuse. So we're kind of examining what people think about these. Parents will often ask me as a clinician, at what age should they stop, bathing together? I have a boy and a girl, and there's no guidelines. Nobody, the American Academy of Pediatrics, nobody has sort of published guidelines about this. So we're replicating a study that was done with professionals, and we're sort of asking, students and everyday people, what do you think? What are the ages that you think this kind of behavior should cease? And we expect to see some cultural differences with that too. I have a doctoral student right now who is a veteran and is examining military sexual trauma. So the sexual harassment and sexual victimization of members of the armed forces, whether it takes place within the armed services or outside of those unique experiences of those survivors. We're also examining the kinds of programs that the armed forces have in place to prevent, harassment and sexual abuse. So that's just a kind of a sampling of some of the things that we do.
Interesting. I think that the military one is very interesting, especially because of the inherent power dynamic that there is. So I feel like I've heard that a lot of the abuse can happen from like maybe the officers towards like the enlisted members. So it gets really tricky when like power is concerned and like they're your governing body, and then if you talk back you can face repercussions. So that's actually a very interesting
yeah, that's exactly right. And sometimes what we're finding out is that the chain of command that you have to report to is actually your offender. So that kind of makes it a little tricky, So yeah, there's an inherent power differential. There's obviously a hierarchy that needs to be in place, right? In the armed forces for other reasons and in times of war and for command purposes, but that doesn't always work well for victims. So that student has collected some preliminary data, and he's also going to be interviewing people who've been in the military, currently in the military, veterans of the military, and then also service providers, people that may have treated victims of military sexual trauma. So yeah, so you can see like that is a good example of his interests align with mine, but they're not exactly what I'm doing,
Right,
but
Yeah.
we
exactly.
sort of share. And I have another doctoral student who's doing work in campus sexual assault. So
Mhm.
again, we overlap with this concern about sexual victimization. He's concerned about it on a campus and prevention and attitudes and ideas towards consent in relationships and gender differences around that. So
Mhm. Okay,
there's always room for more research.
right,
Yeah.
for sure.
No, I think that's definitely an interesting thing to think about, right? Where the interests in research kind of overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
And also, of course, something for undergraduates who are trying to be research assistants, as well as, prospective graduate students to think about, right? It doesn't have to be to the T, but kind of like what you were saying, how people are also kind of interviewing you either as a graduate professor or as a PI, right? They're seeing, is this something that will be beneficial to me in my future interests as well? I did want to kind of go back to when you were discussing on kind of mandatory reporters, right? I think that's something I found really interesting when I was kind of looking into the Mass Lab. Is that a lot of mandatory reporters, they know what abuse looks like, but they don't know exactly how to go about reporting it or at like which level, they should report it. So they know this might feel a little off, but is this like necessarily the level of abuse? And I think that's especially like interesting to consider thinking about cultural competencies, right? To someone whose family has been in the US for, generations, for instance, spanking, right? Corporal punishment might just be that's physical abuse, just written off that way. But to first generation, especially like Latinx, immigrants, spanking is not abuse. And I think that's like a very interesting thing to think about. And I love that, like, you're kind of going into that, right? Not just making blanket rules, but also like cultural competency and how different
Yeah.
generations view things.
Right. And that's it's an excellent point. We actually was having dinner with some friends this weekend who raised their kids in Tennessee, and they said that they had to sign a form that said it was okay for the schools to spank the kids or something.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
wow.
Yeah, it's crazy, or
Okay.
they were sent home a notice. I'll have to follow up on that, but
Mhm.
so it varies not even outside of the US, but
Oh,
within the US, and I
yeah.
haven't dug deep into that recently, but paddling was allowed in a lot of schools. Corporal
Oh.
punishment is allowed in a lot of schools still. But yeah, there's a big cultural divide between these sort of disciplinary and parenting practices, and that's something that we're interested in. The other area of work there too is increasing the education and knowledge level of mandatory reporters, right? To say, like, I know I'm a mandatory reporter, but I don't quite know how to do this. And
Yeah.
programs address that to different degrees. So one of my roles at the university actually is to provide that kind of guidance and training to programs or departments that need it. So I spend a fair amount of time going around the campus when asked and presenting to the medical school, a counseling program, a teacher training program about that topic,
Right.
and increasing people's awareness of how to be compliant with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes me think of, I recently took a psychotherapy class, and the professor was saying how a lot of people can recognize abuse, but then they don't necessarily know what to do about it. And then this one classmate of mine, she worked as an RBT, and she was saying how one of the children that she works with, they really came in with like a strong smell of urine and then stains on her clothes that have been there for like the past couple of weeks, and that she knew that she had to report it, but she kind of didn't know if it was in like within her job role. And like,
Well,
yeah.
yeah. In Florida,
Mhm.
it's universal reporting.
Mhm.
So everybody is a reporter. Anybody who has cause to believe or suspect that abuse is happening reports. Certain people are elevated to mandatory reporters, like people in legal, medical, health, education. But if you saw your neighbor beating the crap out of their kid, you would be obligated to report that in Florida.
Right. So, and then
So
what are
yeah.
some barriers that you have found that clinicians specifically face in reporting abuse? Like, what do you think stops them specifically from doing so?
Yeah, so there's a number of barriers, and we've actually written about these as well. One is a lack of training, so not really understanding the role, what to do. the threshold for reporting, right? You know, what transcends that threshold. Then there's a fear of consequences for themselves sometimes, you know, what if the family gets mad at me? What if the child gets mad at me? Fear of what will happen to the child sometimes too, like, well, I've reported this, but now it's up to the system, you know. So there's all these sort of things people tell themselves or worry about rather than really focusing on their legal and ethical responsibility to try to intervene and stop abuse, you know. But yeah, there's a number of barriers. Also, sometimes people work in places that aren't supportive of it. You know, you tell your supervisor and the supervisor's like, no, we're not going to report that, you know. And I've worked in places like that. So I know that happens, you know. For some reason, there's a fear of, you know, repercussion or, you know, and I've made literally hundreds of reports in my lifetime, and I have never had any retaliation, any, you know, repercussions because of that. And talking about how to handle that is a whole other discussion and a more sort of clinical thing, but people can be trained to do that correctly and to do that with empathy. I did want to mention one thing, just to go back, what you guys were saying about working in the labs, where, you know, you may also want to ask during that interview how much contact you have with the PI, because there are some labs where, again, that hierarchy, you know, you're working with the graduate student, or the graduate student runs the lab. You know, when I was an undergrad in the alcohol behavior research lab, I never saw the PI, never. Yeah, I mean, I saw him coming in and out, you know, but I really did not have a lot of direct contact with him. I'm sure the doctoral graduate students did. And I still was able to get an amazing letter of recommendation, you know, because they then rely on the doctoral students that are working closely. But so, you know, that's kind of important to know, because if you're thinking, oh, this is great, I'm going to hang out with, you know, Professor X all the time, that might not be how the lab works, you know. So are there lab meetings? Or there, you know, what kind of contact do you have?
Right. And then on that note, would you have any specific advice to help undergrads find a mentor?
Yeah, I mean, I think in psychology, we have a list of, you know, most labs have a way to contact them and express an interest. So that would be a good starting point, you know. But I think it's also important to recognize that that's probably the culture of many labs, right? Is that, you know, there's different level, you know, I'm not having lunch with the president at FIU every day, you know.
Right.
So, you know, everybody sort of works in a hierarchy where you have access, you know, to certain people. But I would say in most labs, if you're doing a good job and the doctoral students are impressed with you, that's getting back to the PI, you know. That's going to make a difference. And, you know, at some point asking to have time with them to mentor you and talk about your career, I think is reasonable.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering our questions.
Sure.
We do want to segue into a segment we call Ask Pass. So basically how it works is we open up questions on our Instagram story so that past members can basically directly ask our interview guests questions. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. I'm going to go through them all, even though I know a few you did already kind of go over, but just so that, you know, we can ask all their questions. So the first question we have is how to get into a lab. So what would you say are like the main steps or like main things to consider from inception to, you know, the first day you walk in, do lab orientation? What are the most important things you'd say to get into a lab?
All right, so preparing a good looking resume, right? Preparing a resume that's up to date, that somebody's proofread for you, that's, you know, contains your GPA and your, you know, maybe perhaps relevant coursework that might be important for that lab, presenting yourself professionally, reaching out, following up maybe, you know. Sometimes it's a squeaky wheel that gets the oil, you know. So when people get a lot of applications, it might be that one student that's kind of persistent. But I think having a good presentation in terms of your resume, and again, being available for interviews and, you know, making yourself accessible.
Speaking of, you know, the squeaky wheel, what would be a good way to reach out to be part of the lab? So I'm going to kind of, I guess, specialize this question a little bit. So for instance, in reaching out to a professor, maybe to ask, oh, is there space in your lab? what would be a good way for a student to kind of set that up?
Well, most labs, if you look at the lab webpage, they have a process which you go through. So whether it's entering your information into a Google Doc or a Qualtrics link, we have a link that we ask people to complete, and then we have a step that says, once you've done that, please also contact Dr. Kenny and attach your resume. So if you haven't done that, we're not going to contact you. So
Yeah.
labs will usually have, or contact this person, or these are the times of years we're taking people. So I think to go to the specific lab page and see how they prefer to, because sometimes, emailing the PI isn't the best way, right? They don't handle that. They're busy. Your email falls through the cracks. So see what process they have in place.
Okay. So definitely specialize it, because that's something, as we were going through the labs, we saw some people did have the Qualtrics. There were some Google Forms. Some people said just send an
Right.
email.
Yeah.
So knowing
Do
that.
what they want. Yeah.
Yeah.
That shows the first step in following directions,
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess more so for those who do prefer an email, right, that may have a less standardized method of contacting, what do you think are the main things to hit in an email when reaching out? Because I know some people, let's be honest, some of the undergrads are not the best email writers, or some people might not know
Right.
exactly what to say or how to structure it.
Right. So I think, use your FIU email. So we know that you're an FIU student, right? Because I'm going to prioritize, I'm not going to have a non-FIU student really working in my lab, right?
Yeah.
So use your FIU email, put in the subject line, interest in lab or research assistant position, and then be very polite, use proper terminology, refer to people by doctor or their professional title. I'm a sophomore at FIU majoring in psychology, have great interest in working in your lab, maybe a sentence or two about why you have an interest in that. If you have some special skills, like you already know SPSS or R or things like that, or you're proficient in, as I said, more creative sides of work, and then attach your resume, and, any other way to contact you. I mean, what if you want to include your cell phone number or something like that, it's on your resume, but if you want to put that in, I think that's it. I don't think I think short and sweet is probably better.
Okay. Okay. And our final question. So I already kind of know the answer to this question is yes, depending on what lab. But so this is more specifically for your lab. Like you said, you do prioritize FIU students, and you also prefer, people in their junior year kind of applying for your lab. But can a former FIU student, they're now at a different school as a graduate, join your lab at FIU?
So they're an FIU alumni
Yes.
and they're at a different school.
Yes.
So they're at a local school, or they're coming for the summer, or what's I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
They
okay.
didn't specify. They just said they're at a different school, but I guess it's safe to assume they're probably at a school, within at least the South Florida.
Yeah, I guess I really haven't been presented with that situation, but I think it would be important for me to prioritize FIU students. We
Yeah.
have so many students that are interested. We have a large undergraduate program at FIU that I really want to help FIU students get, where they're going. Perhaps if they had a particular skill set, or there was something that they were really bringing to the table. And maybe if it was for a short period of time, like I said, a summer, and they want to work on a specific project or something. But I guess it's possible. Anything's possible, but really haven't had that happen.
Okay. So just to kind of go further into that a bit, like, have you had any kind of post baccalaureate students work in your lab, or it's just mainly undergrads, right?
Yeah, mainly undergrads. Yeah. And some master's level students.
Okay.
Students that are getting their master's degree that might be interested in gaining a little bit more research experience. I've certainly had plenty of those. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not sure to what extent you'd be able to answer this, but are you familiar with how most labs kind of work in that regard when it comes to accepting postbacks? Because I know your lab isn't, doesn't
Yeah,
do.
I do think that labs do that, I think that there's a need for that, and I know some students that have done that at FIU, so I think that's probably lab dependent,
Yeah.
whether or not they may be able to hire somebody as a post-bac, right? On
Mhm.
some grant funding, and there might be a position for somebody in that capacity.
Okay, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you have anything you would like to add? Any final thoughts?
No, I think we did. I think we covered a lot of it. Hopefully it's some good information for your listeners.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. It was great for us.
Mhm.
You honestly gave us a lot of amazing
Oh,
information.
great, great. Yeah,
So thank you so much.
sure.
So bye everyone. Thank you for watching.